The halls of Ridgewood High were always quiet after hours, a place that felt alive with whispers of past horrors. But none of the students who lingered late after school truly understood the terrifying history of the school. They thought they knew the place, but the building itself was far older than anyone realized, and some of its walls, hidden deep in the school's history, held secrets that no one could have ever imagined. It all began on a rainy autumn evening, a night like any other. The football team had just finished their practice, and a group of students stayed behind in the library to work on a project. They were tired, focused only on finishing the work to get home, when strange things started to happen. At first, it was little things. Books seemed to shift positions on the shelves. Papers that had been neatly stacked on tables scattered themselves across the room. But then, one of the students, Sarah, noticed something that made her stomach drop. The door to the supply closet, which had been firmly closed, was now slightly ajar. A cold draft blew through the room, causing the lights to flicker. The group laughed it off, blaming the old wiring, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She told her friends to ignore it, but as they gathered their things to leave, she saw it again, a shadowy figure moving near the window, obscured by the heavy rain. But when she looked directly, there was nothing there. Unsettled, Sarah turned to her friends. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. But no one else had noticed anything unusual. They were too eager to leave. "Come on, Sarah," one of them said. "You're just tired. Let's go." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. They made their way out of the library, but as they walked through the hallways, the air grew thicker, colder. It was as though the walls themselves were watching them. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed down the hallway. The group froze, hearts pounding. Sarah's breath hitched as the sound grew louder, closer, like something was chasing them. It wasn't until they reached the end of the hallway that they saw it. A tall, thin figure standing at the far end, its face obscured by a hood. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stared. Frozen with fear, the group stood still for what felt like an eternity. But just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The hallway was empty. The students ran out of the school that night, adrenaline surging through their veins. They didn't speak much about the encounter, chalking it up to exhaustion and a few too many late-night horror movies. But for Sarah, the memory stayed with her, haunting her every night. The fear of the figure, the feeling of being watched, never left. Months passed, and life at Ridgewood High seemed to return to normal. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the school. She dug into its history, starting with its construction. What she uncovered sent a chill down her spine. Ridgewood High had been built on the grounds of an old asylum that had burned down decades earlier, its patients never accounted for, their bodies never found. Whispers of dark experiments, abuse, and death surrounded the place, and it was said that the souls of those who perished in the fire still roamed the school's hallways. Sarah, now desperate to uncover more, returned to the school at night. Armed with only her phone and a flashlight, she ventured down the corridors, guided by the fading light of the school's flickering bulbs. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as she made her way toward the old wing, the section of the building that had been sealed off after a series of strange occurrences years before. It was here that Sarah felt the air grow colder, her breath visible in the beam of her flashlight. The walls seemed to close in on her as she approached a locked door at the end of the hallway. Her heart raced as she fumbled for the keys, which she had managed to steal from a janitor earlier. The door creaked open, and inside, she found herself staring into the forgotten wing of the school. The room was filled with old furniture, the remnants of long-abandoned classrooms. But the most unsettling thing was the thick layer of dust on the floor, which had been disturbed. Footprints, new ones, marred the surface. She was not alone. Before she could turn to leave, she felt something cold brush against her neck. Spinning around, her flashlight fell on the face of a pale, gaunt figure. Its hollow eyes stared at her with a malevolent intensity. It opened its mouth, but no words came out, only a sound like crackling flames, a soft whisper that seemed to burn into her ears. The figure reached out to her, its hands long and bony. As it touched her arm, a sudden, overwhelming pain coursed through her body like 1,000 needles sinking into her skin. She screamed, stumbling back, but the figure followed, its hollow gaze never leaving her. She managed to break free, running down the dark hallway, heart pounding in her chest. But no matter how fast she ran, she could hear the sound of footsteps behind her, getting closer, faster. She turned corners, sprinted through hallways, but it was always there, a shadow in the corner of her eye, a presence she couldn't escape. When she finally burst out into the main hallway, gasping for air, she looked back. The building was silent again. The figure was gone. The next day, Sarah tried to forget about the encounter, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The walls of Ridgewood High had absorbed years of pain and torment, and now the spirits of those who had died in the asylum were awake, restless. Sarah knew she couldn't leave. She was bound to this place, connected to the horrors that had taken place there. But she also knew one thing for sure: the horrors of Ridgewood High weren't finished yet. And as the days passed, other students started to disappear, each one last seen near the old wing. Sarah's warnings fell on deaf ears. Ridgewood High's halls were filled with the screams of the past, and now they were starting to claim the future. No one was safe. The darkness of the school had come to life, and it would never let go.
Story number 2.
The air inside Eastbrook High School always seemed stale, even during the brightest of days. It was as if something ancient and malevolent lurked within its walls, waiting for the right moment to strike. For years, the students had whispered rumors, but it wasn't until the arrival of a new student that the true terror of Eastbrook would reveal itself. Lucas had transferred to Eastbrook at the beginning of his senior year, hoping to escape the shadow of his past. But from the moment he set foot in the school, something felt off. The hallways were too quiet, the lights too dim. The other students didn't seem to notice, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. One afternoon, while walking through the abandoned wing of the school, an area that had been closed off for years due to structural issues, Lucas stumbled upon a door that had been cracked open. Curious, he pushed it further, entering a classroom that had been untouched by time. The air was thick with dust, the chalkboards covered in a strange, jagged writing, as if someone had desperately scratched the walls in a frantic attempt to escape. A chill ran down his spine as he examined the room. His eyes were drawn to a large, old mirror hanging on the far wall, its surface cracked and smeared with what looked like dried blood. As Lucas gazed into it, he noticed a figure standing just behind him, reflected in the glass. It was tall, its features obscured by a dark hood, but the thing that made Lucas's blood run cold was the shadowy figure's eyes. They were glowing red, burning with a hatred that seemed to pierce into his soul. Lucas spun around, but no one was there. He blinked, and the reflection in the mirror was gone. Heart pounding, he backed out of the room and slammed the door shut, but the unease lingered. That night, as he lay in bed, trying to forget the eerie experience, he heard something tapping at his window. At first, he dismissed it as the wind, but then the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Slowly, he got up and peered out into the darkness, but the only thing he saw was his own reflection staring back at him. No figure, no shadow. He closed the curtains, brushing it off as nothing more than nerves. But that was only the beginning. The next day, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Everywhere he went, he would see fleeting glimpses of someone in the corners of his vision, always standing just out of reach. The feeling of eyes watching him, tracking his every move, grew so overwhelming that he began to dread even leaving class. It wasn't until a week later, during a late-night study session in the library, that Lucas discovered the truth. He was scrolling through the school's old records when he came across something that made his stomach churn. There had been rumors about a student who had vanished from Eastbrook years ago, a senior named Andrew who had been obsessed with the mirror in the abandoned wing. The records described how Andrew had spent countless hours in front of it, his behavior growing more erratic as time went on. One night, after a particularly strange encounter with the mirror, Andrew had simply disappeared, leaving behind only a scribbled message on the chalkboard. The reflection is not what it seems. The message sent a wave of cold dread through Lucas. He knew what he had to do. Armed with the knowledge from the records, he returned to the abandoned wing the very next night. As he entered the room with the cursed mirror, the atmosphere felt different, heavy, suffocating. The temperature seemed to drop, and Lucas's slack breath came out in visible puffs as though the room had turned to ice. The mirror, now cracked even more than before, seemed to beckon him. Against his better judgment, Lucas approached it. As soon as he stood before the glass, a sharp pain shot through his head, and the reflection began to distort. The figure he had seen before appeared once more, but this time it was clearer. The hooded figure smiled at him, its lips curling into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Without warning, the figure reached out of the mirror, its bony hand stretching through the glass, grabbing Lucas by the throat. He gasped, struggling against its grip, but it was too strong, its cold fingers tightening. He could hear whispers in his ears, words he couldn't understand, but they filled him with an overwhelming sense of terror. The reflection was no longer just a mirror, it was a gateway, a prison for something ancient and malevolent. Panicking, Lucas grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it against the mirror. The glass shattered, and the creature's grip loosened, releasing him from its clutches. He stumbled backward, gasping for air, but when he looked up, the hallway was silent again. The figure was gone. Lucas never spoke about what he saw, but the terror stayed with him, gnawing at his sanity. And as the weeks passed, the strange occurrences only escalated. His classmates, once oblivious, began to notice the odd happenings, the whispers in the halls, the sudden chills, and the shadows that seemed to flicker in the corners of their vision. One by one, students began to disappear. Some were last seen walking toward the abandoned wing, others simply vanished without a trace. It didn't take long before rumors of the cursed mirror and the malevolent entity trapped within it spread throughout the school. But there was no escape. As the final bell rang on Lucas's last day at Eastbrook, he looked back at the school, feeling the weight of its darkness pressing down on him. It wasn't over. The entity still lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to claim. And somewhere, deep within the school's heart, the mirror was waiting, hungry, watching, its surface cracked and ready to pull in another unsuspecting victim.
Story number 3.
The clock struck midnight at Maplewood High, but the school was far from quiet. The halls, usually filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter, now felt suffocatingly silent. Only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights broke the eerie stillness. The night janitor, an old man named Mr. Ellis, was sweeping the main hallway, his broom dragging across the floor in monotonous rhythm. What he didn't know was that tonight would be different. Tonight, the building would reveal its true nature. For years, there had been rumors circulating among the students about the school's dark history. Some claimed that the school was built on the grounds of an old asylum, abandoned after a series of mysterious deaths. Others said it was haunted by the spirits of the patients who died there. But no one had ever dared to investigate until a small group of students decided they would finally uncover the truth. The group, consisting of Sarah, Mark, Lisa, and Tommy, had always been skeptical of the supernatural, but there was something about Maplewood that intrigued them. They'd heard stories of strange occurrences, whispers in empty classrooms, lights flickering for no reason, and doors that would suddenly slam shut. Their curiosity got the better of them, and they made plans to sneak into the school late at night, hoping to get to the bottom of it. They arrived at the school just before midnight, the only sounds the crunch of leaves under their feet and their nervous laughter as they approached the back entrance. The door was locked, but Sarah had come prepared. She had found a spare key from one of the janitors. They crept inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like tiny beams of hope in the oppressive night. The group made their way down the hallway, each of them tense and on edge. Every step seemed to echo in the empty corridors, making them feel as though something was just behind them, watching. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hung heavy. As they passed the old classrooms, they noticed something strange. The doors, which were supposed to be locked, were wide open. The rooms inside were empty, except for a strange, unsettling energy that seemed to cling to the walls. It wasn't until they reached the basement door that things began to take a darker turn. The door was old and rusted, with a single faded sign that read, "Do not enter." Mark, being the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish of the group, pushed open the door. The stairs leading down into the basement were narrow and steep, but without hesitation they descended into the depths of the school. The basement was colder than they had expected. It was a labyrinth of old storage rooms, all filled with forgotten relics from the past. But as they ventured deeper into the basement, the temperature seemed to drop even further. Their breaths came out in visible puffs and their flashlights flickered erratically. The air felt heavy, almost as if it was pressing down on them. Suddenly, they heard a noise, a faint scratching, like something dragging along the floor. At first, they thought it was just the sound of old pipes or the wind, but as the noise grew louder, they began to panic. Tommy, who was closest to the sound, turned a corner and froze. There, in the farthest corner of the basement, was an old wooden door. The scratching sound was coming from inside. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the door hadn't been part of the basement's original design. It had been added later, and the wood looked warped, as if it had been there for decades. Before anyone could say anything, Tommy pushed the door open. The room inside was pitch black, the air thick and stifling. But what they saw when they turned on their flashlights made their blood run cold. The walls were covered in strange cryptic symbols, carved into the wood and stone like some kind of ritualistic markings. And in the center of the room, sitting motionless on the floor, was an old, rusted metal chair. The seat was stained a dark red color, old blood, it seemed. But it wasn't the chair that horrified them the most. It was the figure sitting in it. A man, thin and gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, was strapped to the chair. His eyes were wide open, but there was no life in them. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, as though frozen in eternal torment. But what made it truly terrifying was the way his eyes followed them. Even though his body was motionless, his gaze never left the group. It was as if he could see them, understand them, even though he was clearly dead. Lisa screamed and turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The temperature dropped again, this time with such intensity that they could see their breath forming in the air. The scratching sound grew louder, closer, and before they could react, the lights went out completely. Panic set in. They fumbled to turn on their flashlights, but the beams of light only seemed to make the darkness worse. The sound of something dragging itself across the floor grew louder, and then they heard it. A voice, raspy and weak, but unmistakable. "Help me," it whispered. "Please, help me." The voice came from the man in the chair. His body remained unmoving, but his eyes were pleading. Without warning, the figure in the chair jerked violently, its body contorting in impossible ways. The room filled with a deafening, high-pitched screeching sound, and the air seemed to vibrate with an oppressive energy. The walls seemed to close in, the symbols on them pulsing with a sickly glow. The group screamed, scrambling to find the door, but no matter where they turned, it felt as though the walls were closing in on them, pressing them together. The scratching sound grew louder, now coming from all directions, like 100 nails scraping against wood. Just when it seemed they would be crushed by the weight of the darkness, the door flung open. They stumbled out of the room, breathless and terrified, and ran back up the stairs, not daring to look back. They didn't stop running until they were outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. None of them spoke about what happened after that night, but none of them ever returned to Maplewood High again. As for the school, it stood silent and empty, its halls echoing with the whispers of the past. But sometimes, if you listen closely enough on a still night, you can hear the faint scratching from the basement, the desperate pleas for help, and the sound of something or someone dragging itself across the floor. And you wonder if the spirits of those lost to the school are still trapped inside, waiting for the next group of curious souls to come too close.
Story number 4.
The sun had just begun to set over Cedar Creek High, casting long shadows across the courtyard. As the final bell rang, students scattered to the exits, eager to leave behind the stress of the school day. But for a few unlucky souls, the night was just beginning. Lena and her friends, Emily, Kate, and Noah, were staying late to finish up a group project in the library. The librarian, Mrs. Ferguson, had left for the day, and the school was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting an unsettling glow over the rows of bookshelves. The library felt bigger at night, as though the walls stretched farther than they should. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you weren't truly alone, no matter how empty it was. Around 9 p.m., Lena decided to step outside for some fresh air. She exited through the side door that led into the school's back parking lot, the one that nobody ever really used except for staff. The night was cool, the air thick with fog that had rolled in. It was then that she noticed something odd. In the far corner of the parking lot, near a row of old, unused storage sheds, stood a figure. It was a man, hunched over, staring at the ground. His posture was strange, unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. Lena squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. He didn't move, didn't seem to notice her watching him. Her heart began to race. She felt the gnawing sensation in her gut. Something was wrong. The man's stillness unsettled her, and before she could think twice, she hurried back inside, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. When Lena returned to the library, she found Emily, Kate, and Noah sitting quietly at the table, staring at the papers in front of them. They were all unnaturally silent, like they were waiting for something. Lena didn't mention the man in the parking lot, thinking it was just her imagination running wild. But the unease in her stomach grew. Hours passed, and the group finally wrapped up their work. They packed up their things and made their way to the front doors. But as they approached, Lena noticed something strange. The school's front doors, usually unlocked and ready to be pushed open, were now locked tight. "That's weird," Emily muttered, jiggling the handle. "They were open when we came in." Noah tried his phone, but the signal was weak, and Kate said the Wi-Fi was down. The group was stuck. "We can try the back door," Lena suggested, her unease growing again. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt a compulsion to get outside, to leave. Something was wrong in the air. They all headed back to the side of the school, and when they reached the back, the door was open. It wasn't just unlocked as they had expected. It was wide open. The fog had thickened, and the parking lot looked strangely deserted. But something didn't sit right. As they stepped outside, a noise interrupted the stillness, a scraping sound like metal dragging against stone. "Did you hear that?" Noah whispered, his voice suddenly full of tension. Lena didn't have to answer. They all heard it, that dragging, scraping sound coming from the storage sheds. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she instinctively took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "What is that?" Kate asked, barely able to keep the panic out of her voice. Without waiting for a response, Noah turned to walk back toward the door, but he stopped. There, near the farthest shed, was the figure again. The man, still hunched over, but now he was dragging something heavy across the ground. "Who the hell is that?" Emily whispered. Lena wanted to say something, to calm everyone down, but she couldn't speak. The man wasn't just standing there anymore. He was dragging something heavy and long, making that scraping noise. And as they watched, the shape of whatever he was dragging slowly became clearer. It was a body, a limp, twisted body that looked like it had been pulled from the depths of some nightmare. The man never looked up. His head was bowed, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by strings. "Run," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't know where the words came from, but they felt urgent, like a command. Without thinking, she turned and sprinted back toward the door, her friends close behind her. They reached the door, but just as Lena's hand touched the handle, a loud, sharp bang echoed from behind them. The man was standing at the door now. His face was a twisted mask of pale, sickly skin with sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through them. His mouth was open in a gaping, silent scream, but there was no sound, only the scraping of something terrible, something unseen, as he reached out with long, bony fingers. His hands were slick with something dark, and his nails, yellowed and cracked, scraped against the door frame. "Run!" Noah screamed, pushing the door open. They burst through the door, scrambling inside. They slammed it shut behind them, but they didn't stop running until they were safely outside, gasping for air. But even then, The image of the man's eyes, the emptiness, the hunger, wouldn't leave their minds. They tried to shake it off, telling themselves it was just a figment of their imagination. But they all knew it wasn't. The next morning, the school was buzzing with the news. The police had been called, and something terrible had happened. The storage sheds had been broken into overnight, and inside one of them, they'd found a body. The man who had been stalking the parking lot was gone, but they couldn't find his face, his name, or even his past. The police said it was just a random act of violence, a tragic incident. But Lena and her friends knew the truth. They had seen the man, and they had felt something worse than fear, something ancient and predatory, something that should have never been allowed to exist. And as the fog crept in again that evening, they couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the parking lot hadn't disappeared. He was still out there waiting.
Story number 5.
It was the last day of school at Redwood High, and for most students, it was a day filled with relief. Summer break was on the horizon, and they could finally leave behind the stress of exams and endless assignments. But for a small group of seniors, Sophie, Ben, Lily, and Ethan, the day would end in a way none of them could have imagined. Sophie had always been curious about the old part of Redwood High, the section of the school that had been closed off for decades. Rumor had it that the building had once housed a special education program that had mysteriously shut down, and no one ever really talked about it. The older students whispered about the cursed hallway, and even the teachers seemed reluctant to speak about it. Sophie had heard the stories all year, and now, on the last day before summer, she was determined to find out the truth. She convinced Ben, Lily, and Ethan to join her. They made their way to the back of the school after the final bell rang, creeping down the hall toward the old section. The door that separated the two parts of the building was locked, but that didn't stop Sophie. She had found a key hidden in the janitor's closet earlier that week. After a few moments of fiddling with the lock, the door creaked open. The hallway beyond was dark and musty. The walls were lined with old lockers, their surfaces scratched and rusted as if they'd been forgotten for years. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of something rotten, but the group pressed on. Sophie led the way, her flashlight illuminating the cracked tiles underfoot. "Are you sure about this?" Ben asked, his voice tight with unease. "This place feels wrong." Sophie nodded. "I have to know what's in here." As they walked further down the corridor, the temperature dropped noticeably. It was as if the building itself was breathing, shifting around them. The walls seemed to close in as they passed empty classrooms, their doors ajar, revealing only blackness within. Then they came to the last room at the end of the hallway. The door was different from the others. It wasn't ajar, but instead had been sealed shut with thick chains. The rusted lock gleamed in the faint light from their flashlights. "I don't think we should open this," Lily said, her voice trembling. "It looks like they wanted to keep something in there." But Sophie was already kneeling in front of the door, her hand reaching for the lock. "We're here. We have to find out what's inside." With a sickening click, the lock came undone. The chains fell away, and the door creaked open, revealing a room that was somehow colder than the hallway outside. Inside was a scene frozen in time. Old desks and chairs were scattered across the room, covered in thick layers of dust. On the far wall, an old cracked chalkboard still had writing on it, strange, cryptic symbols that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But it wasn't the room that disturbed them the most. It was the shadow. At first, Sophie thought it was just the flickering light from her flashlight. But as she stepped further inside, she realized it was a figure, tall, hunched over, with a long coat that billowed around it like smoke. The figure was facing the chalkboard, motionless, as though it had been there for as long as the room had been abandoned. The group froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could feel the weight of the air around them, suffocating and thick. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge their presence. It was as if they weren't even there. But then the figure spoke. Its voice was raspy, like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "Leave. Now." The words echoed in the room, sending a wave of terror through the group. Ethan was the first to turn and run, his footsteps echoing as he bolted down the hallway. Ben and Lily followed, but Sophie couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor as she stared at the figure, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Leave," the figure repeated, its voice growing more insistent. "Leave before it's too late." Sophie finally snapped out of her trance and turned to run, but as she did, she heard a sound that stopped her dead in her tracks. The chains, those same rusted chains that had held the door shut, were rattling. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 chains being dragged across the floor. The figure was moving now, slowly, deliberately, its head turned toward her, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Sophie ran as fast as she could, her heart racing, her lungs burning. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear the figure's footsteps behind her, getting closer and closer, like something stalking her through the dark. When they finally made it out of the hallway, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, leaving them standing in the silent, empty hallway. They were safe, at least for now, but as they caught their breath, a cold shiver ran down their spines. They couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, something that wasn't finished with them yet. The next day, the school was buzzing with an unexpected announcement. The entire old wing of Redwood High was being torn down. The district had decided to renovate the building, but there was something strange about the timing. The workers were scheduled to start that very morning. Sophie didn't tell anyone what had happened in the basement of the school. She couldn't explain it, and even if she could, no one would believe her. But as she looked out of the window of her last class, she saw the workers starting to demolish the old building. And in the reflection of the glass, she saw something she hoped never to see again. The figure, standing in the wreckage, watching her. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, Sophie could hear its voice, whispering in her ear, "It's not over."
Story number 6.
It was the dead of winter when the power went out at Westbrook High. The storm had come in fast, the winds howling outside like something furious, clawing at the windows. The school was nearly empty by the time the power cut off. Most students had already left for the day, eager to get home before the snow piled up too high. But a small group of after-school club members were still finishing up in the building. Among them was Jake, a senior who had stayed behind to work on his photography project. His friend Rachel was nearby, sorting through some notes, while a few others worked in the library. The school, usually buzzing with life, now felt empty, almost too quiet. The flickering of the emergency lights cast an eerie glow, and the absence of the hum of the regular lights made it all feel wrong. The wind outside picked up, and the old school windows creaked and rattled in protest. "Looks like we're stuck here until the power comes back on," Jake said, trying to lighten the mood. Rachel gave him a tired smile, though she didn't seem very reassured by his words. The storm was worsening, and the snow was piling up outside, leaving no chance of getting home anytime soon. They decided to kill time by exploring the building. Jake suggested they check out the old section of the school, an area that had been closed off for years. It was a part of the school that nobody ever spoke about. The rumors had persisted since he'd been in middle school. People whispered about how strange things happened there, how some students had gone missing in the halls, only to be found days later, acting like they'd seen something they couldn't explain. At first, Rachel hesitated. "Are you sure? Isn't it off limits for a reason?" Jake, always the skeptic, shrugged. "It's probably just some old lockers and dusty rooms. Nothing scary." With that, they made their way to the back of the school, where the old section was tucked away behind a steel door that was usually locked. Surprisingly, it wasn't. The door creaked open easily, and the two stepped inside, the musty air instantly hitting them. The smell of mildew, old paper, and something faintly sour filled their noses. The hall was dim, lit only by the emergency lights, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. They walked down the hallway, their footsteps echoing off the bare walls. It was a time-worn part of the school, old lockers lined up against the walls, some with their doors hanging off. But there was something unsettling about it. It felt as though they were being watched, even though there was no one else around. "What was that?" Rachel asked suddenly, her voice trembling. Jake froze. From somewhere deep within the hallway came a soft, dragging sound. At first, it was barely audible, like the scrape of metal against stone. Jake gave her a nervous grin. Probably the wind rattling the pipes or something. They kept walking, though the sound seemed to grow louder, closer. It was unmistakable now, a dragging, scraping noise that seemed to follow them no matter how far they walked. Jake's unease began to grow, but he refused to show it. They reached the end of the hallway, where a set of old, rusted double doors stood ajar. The dragging noise was now right behind them. "Let's get out of here," Rachel said, her voice tight with fear. She turned to leave, but Jake grabbed her arm. No, wait. His heart was pounding, but there was something that intrigued him. Something about the door. He pushed it open. The room beyond was darker than the hallway, and the air was colder. As they stepped inside, the scraping noise stopped. But something else had begun, a low, rhythmic thumping, as if something was moving across the floor. And then, faintly, a voice, a whisper. "Help me." Rachel gasped and grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to leave now." Jake was about to agree when he saw something in the corner of the room. There, barely visible in the dim light, was a shape. Something hunched, dragging itself across the floor. It was a man, or at least, it had once been one. His body was contorted in unnatural ways, his limbs bent at grotesque angles. His face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared directly at them. His mouth moved, but no sound came from it. Instead, the low thumping continued as his body dragged itself forward, inching closer to them with every passing second. Rachel screamed. Jake tried to move, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, his mind scrambling for an explanation, but there was none. What he was seeing couldn't be real. It couldn't be. The figure stopped, its hollow gaze still fixed on them. For a moment it was silent. Then the scraping sound returned, only now it was louder, more frantic. The figure's mouth opened wide and a guttural, inhuman scream tore through the room. It wasn't a sound that belonged to a human being. It was something darker. That was enough to snap them both out of their trance. They ran faster than they had ever run in their lives. The scraping noise behind them grew louder, more desperate, as though whatever was chasing them was closing in with every step. They reached the doors of the old section, but they were stuck. The doors wouldn't open. They pounded on them, desperation flooding their veins. Behind them, they could hear the sound growing closer, closer. Then the door finally swung open. The hallway was empty. They stumbled out, gasping for air, their hearts pounding in their chests. They turned back to look. The door to the old section was now shut tight. The hallway was silent once more. The storm raged on outside as Jake and Rachel made their way back to the main part of the school, but neither of them spoke as they walked. When they reached the front doors, they noticed something strange. There were no other cars in the parking lot. No one was left. The school seemed completely empty now, as though everyone had vanished in an instant. As they sat in the parking lot waiting for the storm to subside, Rachel turned to Jake, her voice a mere whisper. Do you think we saw a ghost?" Jake didn't respond at first. His eyes were wide, his mind reeling with what they'd seen. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I don't know, but we're never coming back here again." And neither of them ever did. But every winter when the storm comes again, the wind howls through the empty hallways of Westbrook High, and sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the faint scraping sound echoing down the halls, as though something, or someone, is still dragging itself through the dark, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close.
Story number 7.
The storm came out of nowhere. It was a calm autumn evening at Millstone High when the sky turned a sickly gray and the wind picked up, howling like an animal in distress. The storm's arrival was so sudden that the school's power flickered and died before most students even realized what was happening. The dark hallways were left illuminated only by the dim glow of emergency lights, casting strange shadows that stretched and twitched like they were alive. Jacob had stayed behind after school to work on a science project, a habit he had recently developed after a rough breakup. His friends had long since gone home, and the school was eerily silent, save for the occasional rumble of thunder outside. He sat in the empty classroom, his eyes glued to his textbook, trying to ignore the sense that something was off. It wasn't long before the storm worsened, and the last few students who had stayed late scattered, leaving Jacob alone in the building. His phone buzzed with a message from his mom, telling him that the roads were too dangerous to drive on. He should stay at school and wait for the storm to pass. The wind outside started to howl louder, and the sound of rain pounding against the windows created a deafening backdrop to the silence inside. Jacob stood up, stretching his stiff muscles, and decided to head for the teacher's lounge to grab a snack. As he walked down the hallway, the emergency lights flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls. His footsteps echoed in the otherwise quiet school, making him feel more isolated with each passing second. Turning a corner near the back of the school, Jacob froze. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, tall and hunched over, as though it were an old man struggling to stand. The figure was facing the wall, not moving, not acknowledging his presence. Jacob's first instinct was to turn around and walk the other way, but something held him there. Curiosity, maybe, or something darker. He stepped closer, his heartbeat quickening. "Hello?" Jacob called out, his voice trembling more than he expected. The figure didn't respond. It remained motionless, its back bent at an odd angle. The dim light flickered again, and the figure slowly turned its head, just enough for Jacob to see its face. The skin was pale, stretched too tight, like it didn't quite belong. The eyes were wide, black as coal, with no whites to be seen. The mouth, unnaturally wide, twisted into a grin that sent a chill through Jacob's bones. The smile didn't reach the figure's eyes. It was a smile that wasn't meant to comfort, but to terrify. Jacob's breath hitched, and he took an involuntary step backward. But the figure's head snapped toward him, its movements too quick, too jerky. It opened its mouth, and in a voice that was nothing more than a guttural rasp, whispered one word: "Leave." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he turned and sprinted down the hallway, the sound of his feet slamming against the floor echoing behind him. He didn't dare look back. The feeling of being watched, of something following him, was unbearable. When he reached the main entrance, the doors were locked. His pulse spiked. Why were the doors locked? The school wasn't supposed to be locked down yet. In his panic, he tried pushing against them, shoving with all his strength, but they wouldn't budge. Then he heard it. The sound of something dragging, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway behind him. It was a sickening scrape, like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Jacob's breath caught in his throat, and he turned toward the noise. The figure was there again, only closer this time, moving toward him with unnatural speed. Its limbs stretched longer as it advanced, and its head tilted to the side, eyes locked on him. Its grin grew wider, impossibly wide, as though it were pleased to see him frozen in place. Jacob didn't wait to see what it would do next. He backed away from the door, running down the hallway toward the nearest exit. The dragging sound followed him, closer now, just a few feet away. He could feel the air grow colder with each step, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out like dark tendrils. When he reached the back exit, he threw open the door and ran out into the storm, not caring that the rain drenched him instantly. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, slamming the door shut and locking it, shaking uncontrollably. As he sat there trying to catch his breath, Jacob glanced back at the school through his rearview mirror. The windows of the school were dark, no lights visible. But as he watched, one of the upper windows flickered, just for a second, then went dark again. And then, in the reflection of the rearview mirror, Jacob saw the figure standing at the back door of the school, staring out into the night. Its grin was still there, wide and waiting, and it wasn't alone. In the shadows around the figure, he could make out more shapes, all standing motionless, their eyes gleaming with hunger. Jacob slammed the car into gear and sped off, his hands gripping the wheel as the storm raged on. He never returned to Millstone High after that night, and he never spoke about what he saw. But every time a storm came, he could still hear the scraping sound in the back of his mind, growing closer with each passing year.